All right, today we are excited to have Dr. Irwyn Ince with us today on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Ince, you've released a book called The Beautiful Community, and I want to dive into that today. I would love for you to talk about, for our audience, people that are listening, can you talk about what is the beautiful community that you're describing?
Sure. Yeah. The beautiful community really is more focused in my imagination and vision on the local church, on our local churches in particular communities, or even um, um, groups of churches in a particular community or city. And biblically speaking, I'm talking about more so the ministry of reconciliation. I describe it this way, that the ministry of reconciliation as demonstrated in the local church by the gathering of people from diverse backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities is the natural outworking of a rich covenantal and theological commitment. That is, if we see and understand and embrace what we find in the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, we will press into pursuing reconciliation and unity and diversity, or beautiful community in our churches.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about what led you to write the book. What led you to say, hey, this is something I need to devote all this time to and to put the book out?
Yeah. Well, it really did. It springs mostly out of my own ministry passion, having a sense of calling to pursue beautiful community as a pastor and church planter, and striving to do that work. I definitely know that I hadn't started out in pastoral ministry with any intent of writing a book, but it was after doing my Doctor of Ministry work and doing my dissertation on identity formation in diverse churches, and I finished that in 2016, where my dissertation advisors were just encouraging me to continue writing, whether or not I turned the dissertation into a book or took the concepts from the dissertation and wrote short articles. They just said, they encouraged me. So that's when it started to kind of germinate in my mind to say, okay, maybe I ought to pursue writing a book. And so I went about at least the thought and taking notes and saying, what will this book be about, and all of these kinds of things. So, yes.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned a moment ago is that if we look from Genesis to Revelation, it'll cause us to press into the beautiful community. Can you give us maybe an overview, a little glimpse? What is it that we see from Genesis to Revelation that would lead us to do that?
Sure. Well, really, when we think about the framework of the scriptures and how we call it the history of redemption, how it unfolds, we have these four panels or frames, if you will: creation, we have the fall, right? We have redemption, salvation in Jesus Christ, and we have glory, right? The new heavens and the new earth, right? It's one way of understanding how the scriptures move. And from the very beginning, when we hear out of God's mouth the first words about humanity, let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness, right? And then we see in Genesis 1:27 and following, right? So he created man in his image, according to his likeness. In the image of God, he created him. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, right? So even there, right, we see, there's diversity, even in the very creation of humanity. certainly gender diversity, but not only that, the mandate to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue it,
Mhm.
is what we understand. It was a cultural mandate to cultivate the earth. Just as God created, right? He brought order out of chaos in the creation story. He gives humanity this mandate: cultivate the earth,
Hmm.
bring it, bring order to it, to the glory of God. And so even if we did not have the fall, you would have had cultural diversity. There would have been a difference in how the earth in places gets cultivated in various places in the earth. And this is because God himself is unity and diversity, diversity and unity, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So he himself is beautiful community.
Hmm.
And so this has an impact for what it means when he says, let us make humanity in our image. So while the fall and sin fractures the image, right? There are all kinds of cracks in the glass, such that sometimes it's hard to make out what the image is.
Yeah.
The mandate doesn't change. The fact that we're the image doesn't change. And the goal, or the destiny of humanity to image God in unity and diversity doesn't change. And so we see the fracturing of humanity in the Tower of Babel, where God confuses our language in response to our sinful rebellion. And then we hear in Genesis 12, in the call of Abraham, the promise to reverse the fractures, when he says to Abraham, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That is, all the families that he just dispersed across the surface of the earth, who confused our language so that we don't understand each other. There's a promise of reunion in Genesis chapter 12, and that flows throughout the scriptures, and we find it at its pinnacle in Jesus Christ, who is the seed of Abraham, right? Who comes to bring this promise to bear. So even our salvation, right, in the Lord Jesus is not just about him making new individuals, a new me. He wants to make a new we.
Yeah.
Right? A new us. And this is seen in his high priestly prayer in John 17, where he prays for those who will come to believe in him through the apostolic word. This is John 17, 20 to 23. And he prays, Father, right, let them be one, even as you and I are one. I and them, and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may believe that you sent me. So even Jesus in his high priestly prayer is praying, saying that the testimony and the most powerful witness to the world that he's real is the unity of his people. And this is unity in diversity. And it gets played out in the epistles. This is what the Apostle Paul is pressing into in the epistles, and like Ephesians and Colossians. We see it in Acts when the Spirit comes in Acts chapter 2, right? And the apostles are speaking in tongues in these different languages, and people are hearing them worship the Lord in their own language. We see it in the diversity of the church in Antioch, in the leadership in Acts chapter 11, and we see the culmination of it in Revelation 7, Revelation 21, Revelation 22, where the tree of life reappears, right? It says, and its branches, right, are on either side of the river of life, which is there in the new city, the holy Jerusalem. And it says the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Right?
Yeah, wow.
So this is where we were headed. This is where God is taking humanity. So there you go. That's That's what I mean.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
of a
and
rich
so
biblical commitment. Yeah,
yeah. And so it's all through the scripture. I mean, this is something that we would have to try to miss it. I mean, it's on every page.
that's right. That's right. We would have to make effort to miss it.
Hmm.
And I would say that this is that we have made that
Yeah.
effort. But I would also say that once you are become blind to something, you kind of need help in being able to see again. You need the Lord to just like in our salvation, right? To open our eyes to see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, right? Um, in this same way, when the church, and specifically, I'm talking about the church in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
This is duplicated other places, but I'm talking particularly here with our divisions that have been ingrained from the early days of the founding of this country to separate people along the lines of race and ethnicity and class, and to legitimize it through misreadings of the scriptures.
Yeah.
Right? Once that stuff becomes embedded, it takes a lot to root it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And 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 when that's in us, like you said, you just now said that, we've missed it on purpose, deliberately overlooked it. Uh, when we overlook that, when we go against this, we are going against the very people that God made us to be. Would you agree? Is that right?
Right. Yes, right. We are because here's the thing. What we're doing is pursuing an idolatrous way of being. Right? The elevation and the consideration of one group of people as innately or ontologically preferable or better than another group of people is idolatry. It's not just a sin. It's certainly right. The Bible talks about the sin of partiality, right? But it is actually idolatry because right, God has declared the fundamental equality and dignity of every person, every human being, not just every individual, but that means groups of people as well. Right. This is why, so just to use a biblical example, the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
God delivered them with a strong arm, a mighty hand, right? Well, why were they enslaved in Egypt? They were enslaved in Egypt because they weren't Egyptian. That's what the Pharaoh said. He essentially says in Exodus 1, we have a Hebrew problem. These Hebrews are not like us.
Wow.
Right? So we need to deal shrewdly with them, lest our enemy come and they align with our enemy. Right? And so, right, this is always connected to false worship, a false elevation of humanity, a centering of ourselves and our group in a way that that dehumanizes others who are made in the image of God.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can you talk about some ways that might happen today? So somebody watching this, listening to this, they might hear that and think, "Oh, okay. Well, I understand that happened in the past. I understand that example of Exodus. My church doesn't do that.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
I would never do that." Can
yeah,
you
yeah,
maybe give some examples of that?
yeah. I mean, I think one of the most significant ways we see this coming to fruition today, even in conversations that Christians have in the church, in the United States is around the question of immigration. Right?
Okay.
You hear like every presidential candidate at least has to talk about how we're going to deal with the immigration issue. Right? And yes, they may be talking about illegal immigration, but it always has a face of color on it. Right? That when people picture in their mind who the people they don't want coming into this country are, the image that likely comes to mind are people of color. And when we start to have the conversations around the issue of immigration, even as Christians, and think of and talk about those people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Othering, right? We, as opposed to, particularly as Christians, our default is to start with, we are considering people who are made in the image and likeness of God and who are worthy of dignity and are valuable immeasurably because of God's declaration. That's the starting point for how we talk about other people, right? But right, that's not what you hear. That's not what you find, right? So it manifests itself in very real ways still even today.
Yeah. And so what is it about this moment that we're in? I mean, here we are now, we're into 2021. What is it about this moment that we're in that makes this beautiful community particularly relevant to today? That this is something the church we need to lean into this beautiful community. What is it about this specific moment?
Yes, this is, you don't want to say, oh, well, this is a more important moment than any other time in history and oversell the significance of our time. But there is a significance to the time in this sense. It's clear. It is clear, right? All the polling you want to follow, it's clear that there is still a high degree of polarization in this country and in the church along lines of race and ethnicity and political persuasion. Right? Yeah. And very often those things are aligned, right? And so and so this is not, in a sense, particularly how it ought to be when you think about the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. Right? That, again, where we started this conversation, that beautiful community is humanity's destiny. And biblically and theologically speaking, right, we understand that when Jesus came, right, when he came and lived, when he was crucified, buried, resurrected, and ascended, his opening lines from his first sermon in Mark is, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I'm here, the kingdom is here. That the kingdom has broken in on the present age. And so we as Christians, therefore, are kingdom people. And what does it mean to be kingdom people? It means a demonstration that in practical ways that Jesus brings reunion, renewal, and reconciliation among humanity. That this is an outworking of our belief in the gospel. And the culture is saying, okay, on the one hand, you have a cultural message of tolerance and of multiculturalism, a high priority on multiculturalism, on diversity and inclusion programs and things in the corporate world, in the culture and in the society.
Mm-hmm.
But that may be reflective of the fact that the law of God is written on our hearts and we can't get away from it, right? But it's not grounded in a biblical truth, in the sense that a biblical commitment to, what I mean is a biblical commitment to why do we pursue this?
Yeah.
So the pursuit of it is bound by God's word, right? The pursuit of unity and diversity and love of neighbor across lines of difference is bound by God's word. Is bound by what God calls love, right? Is bound by what God calls humanity to do and be. And so on the one hand, you have this language about diversity and inclusion that just says any and everything goes, right? Right. So we're tolerant. We're for tolerance until you say something we don't want to tolerate.
Yeah.
Right. And then, right. And then there's the reality of cancel culture. Then you get canceled, right? Where the scriptures call us to something that is much deeper and much more robust than that. And here's what I mean. When people are fighting for issues of justice and equality and things, I said, well, okay, what does it look like for you to get everything that you want? Right? In Christ, what it looks like for me or for us to get everything that we want is reconciliation between enemies. It means those who were against me, against us, are not only for us, we're now family. So we're not just trying to win and reject some groups, somebody, right? And to take our place at the top. We're seeking a reunion, a renewal, and a reconciliation that brings into actual intimate communion people who might have nothing in common or might have nothing to do with one another, except for the fact that Jesus gave himself for them. Mm-hmm. That is a message that is desperately needed today, to be not only proclaimed with our mouths, but to be pursued in practice. So that the world can actually see, right? I say it this way, I say that people should look at the church and marvel. It should be an amazement to say, how did that happen? Like, how are those people together? They're from different sides of the spectrum politically. They are from opposite different races and ethnicities and classes of socioeconomic classes of people, right? They vote differently in the voting booth, but they love one another in real life, right? What is that about? Right? That's why this pursuit of beautiful community is so timely and needed.
Yeah. I love that image. And, it's just so in such stark contrast to not only what we see in the culture, but a lot of times we even see what you're describing. It's in contrast to what we do here in the church, that this kind of biblical worldview, this biblical framework is not there. This is the talking points on my side, and we do just want to be on top.
Yes. Right.
And so what does that say about maybe where the church is, that's that more and more it seems as if that is our starting place rather than a biblical worldview,
Mm-hmm. You
politics,
know,
other things.
yeah. So let me say a couple of things. As first, I don't want to be naive or make it appear that I'm being naive and acting as though our divisions happened in a vacuum,
Hmm.
right? That we didn't get here in 2021 by accident, right? There are things that happened through the course of history that caused these divisions, right? Um, and um, and at the same time, right? How do we deal with what is before us in the present reality? And people have talked for a long time about cultural captivity. Christians talk about the cultural captivity of the church. And that, right? We look at that biblically, right? We look at that in terms of even the Old Testament, the people of Israel, their cultural captivity and being influenced by the nations around them, right? And turning their eyes away from what God has said and being and taking, right, the ungodly things from the culture, right? We see it in the New Testament. We see Paul railing at to the church in Corinth, right? So it's not, the idea of cultural captivity is not anything that's new. It's something that has been with the people of God from the beginning, and we know that it's not something that we will ever kind of get away from having to press against until glory.
Hmm.
Part of that is because there actually is no non-cultural way of doing life. There's no non-cultural way of being at the church or of being a Christian, right? There isn't, right?
Yeah.
Um, so what we have to do is be willing to examine the ways in which we are being influenced by cultural commitments that are not in line with the Lord and his word, right? So there's no way to not have quote unquote cultural commitments and cultural ways of being,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no non-cultural life,
Yeah.
but there is a need to 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 view, to filter, to engage and assess the things that we do and believe um, um, by what God says in his word, to be able to discern what aspects of our cultural commitments are influencing us toward ungodly ways of being, and to be willing to ask those hard questions and not just presume, oh, it's them over there, they're the ones who are culturally captive, right? And we're not.
Mm.
It
Yeah.
is them, because and you hear this kind of language in, if so, right, we heard a prominent um evangelical pastor say in 2020, as it relates to the presidential election, that if you're a Christian, you have to vote Republican, or something to the effect, right? That you you can't be a Christian and not vote Republican, right? To tie my faith intimately to a political party,
Mm.
right? That's a cultural captivity,
Yeah.
right? That where I can't actually even critique or even find reasons why I shouldn't support
Yeah.
certain individuals or a certain party platform. This is true on both sides of or every side of the political spectrum. But right, that kind of right, that's where you see this captivity just kind of, and there's a blindness to it, right? Or an unwillingness to see it in ourselves. Right.
Yeah. Does that captivity lead to what you call in the book the ghettoization of humanity?
I would say that it's a result, it's an implication
Okay.
of the ghettoization of humanity.
Can you talk about what that is? I love that section of your book. Can you talk about what that is, and maybe even what are some of the ghettos that we're in today? We may not even know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this imagery of the ghettoization of humanity, right? By ghetto, I don't mean, it's kind of common usage in our current vernacular of a densely populated urban community, of lower economic status people, of people of color. I mean our segregated groups that are finding our sense of identity and dignity and value from this group. And it has its roots biblically, in my view, in the Tower of Babel incident that I mentioned earlier, where Genesis 11:1 is the last time, humanity was one big happy family, right? It said the whole earth had spoke the same language and had the same words, right? And after the flood, God had reissued the command to Noah and his sons, Genesis 9:1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Genesis 10 starts a new section in the book, the generations of the sons of Noah. There's nations and where they are across the face of the earth. And then you get in Genesis 11:1 into the story. How did this disbursement of these nations on the face of the earth happen? It starts with Genesis 11:1. God said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And it says they migrated east and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there and said, let's build ourselves a city with a tower with its height extending to the heavens. Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed from here over the face of the whole earth. Right? In clear and utter rebellion against God's explicit command. God comes down in judgment and in mercy, in judgment, and confuses our language and says that, right? And so we can no longer understand each other. And it says they stopped building the city and the tower. And it says, and the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, right? And that's the roots of this ghetto. Now, I get my sense of what it means to be human almost completely from my ghetto. Who are my people? And by natural disposition, I am suspicious of folk from a different ghetto.
Yeah, wow.
We don't speak the same language. We don't have the same customs. And it's more often, I think we're right and you're wrong. Right? Right? We don't naturally see the difference and have a curiosity of saying, how is the beauty of the Imago Dei, the image of God, manifested through this difference? Right? So I think that this polarization that we're talking about, right, this political polarization, these other polarizations, these ghettos, again, right, they can be political, right? The human imagination is almost limitless.
Yeah.
in what we can do with our genius and what we can do with our sin, right? So we have racial and ethnic ghettos, We can have socioeconomic ghettos, academic ghettos, generational ghettos, right? We can have all these different ways of and really what I mean is centering my sense of self. Who am I? Right? And as I say at one point in the book, only Jesus Christ can bear the weight of the center of our identity. Right? Only he, my whatever other identity I might have, my blackness, my academic achievement, right, my maleness, whatever it is, it can't bear the whole weight of the center of who I am, right? Because that just sets me in a pole against people who have a different identity.
Wow. And so what is a way to think about beginning to move forward? You know, maybe somebody's watching this, you know, their church leader, something like that. What's a way that they can begin to move forward? You know, one of the things that I've heard you talk about in other interviews and even in your book is that this is not a tangent of the gospel. That what you're talking about is a central gospel issue.
Yes.
Could you said that a little bit earlier, but could you just maybe go into a little bit more detail that what you're saying, this is central to the gospel, what you're talking about right now?
Yes. And I use this term devoting to the doctrine.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is devoting to this pursuit of beautiful community, this pursuit of unity and diversity as a foundational reality, a central reality of working out the implications of the gospel in our lives. Because if you know, reconciliation with God and reconciliation with one another, right, are at the heart of the gospel.
Yeah.
Right. Reconciliation with God through faith in Jesus Christ, and then pursuing reconciliation with one another. Love of neighbor. I mean, right, it boils down to, what does Jesus say? Right? What is the greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? And that means we've been reconciled with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And we pursue this reconciliation, this love of neighbor with others across every dividing line, right? And when I say that devoting to it as a doctrinal reality and not simply a nice to have, we have to, because it's too hard to do. We can't pursue it in our own strength. It's too hard. You'll give up. It's much easier. I mean, it's hard enough to do and press into Christian life in a mono-ethnic, in a monocultural, in a mono-racial context, right? It's hard enough.
Yeah.
Adding the kinds of dynamics that come when we try to love across lines of racial and ethnic, socioeconomic difference, we'll give up if we don't believe that this is at the heart of our gospel pursuit. We'll give up, right? So that's why we've got to be devoted to this as at the heart of the gospel, not as a tangent, nice to have aspect of the gospel. Right? So, and if we do that, and some of the other things I talk about in the book, if we do that, we'll be willing to what I call probe the preferences. And I talked about this a little bit earlier in our conversation when I said, oh, well, what are our blind spots? What are the cultural commitments that we have here, right? That the way that we're doing life, ministry, church, that are a result of certain preferences that we have culturally. And I'm not necessarily saying identifying sinful practices here, because as I said, there's no non-cultural way of doing things, right? But we should be willing to explore, why do we do the things that we do in the ways that we do them? Why do we make these choices, right? You know, as a pastor, why do I choose these examples or application points in my sermon, right? I'm preaching this text, right? But I'm going to make some application points, and I'm going to make some application points, right? To Lord willing, help people understand the implications of what God is saying through His Word to our lives, right? What am I going to draw on in making those application points? Right. Yeah. Oh, is it right? How is that culturally informed? And how might that change? And what might I have to do to learn to be able to use some different application points that speak to people from diverse groups? Right. And it's just a practical example. I'm just saying, so probing the preferences, right, means kind of examining how our cultural commitments inform and influence our lives as God's people. Mm-hmm. And not to say that, again, this is identifying sinful patterns. It might mean that, but I'm saying it's identifying, asking probative questions about the decisions we're making in terms of how we're doing life as God's people, and in what ways might those choices hinder people who are not like the majority among us from finding a sense of welcome and belonging.
And that's a practical way to do this, right? That's, you know, in your book, you talk about how pursuing diversity, multi-ethnic churches, it's going to look differently. There's going to be different practices according to different contexts, but what you just now said, that's going to be something that's true across the board.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Is there anything else like that here's some things for people that, as we want to move into this, as we need to get really intentional here. Yes. These are a few things. Probing the anything else is true?
Yeah, let me answer that by honing in on the point that you just made. And when you use the word, you know, different in different contexts, this is so important. You know, we talk about devoting to the doctrine, probing the preferences. Those preferences are going to be different. Because where you are, who you are, it's really important to understand that there is no kind of cookie cutter way of going about this. It is contextual.
Yeah.
Where are we? Who are our neighbors? Who are we? Right? These kinds of questions. And so we, in the ministry work that I lead, our Institute for Cross-Cultural Mission, what we utilize a tool, we call it, I refer to it as a common grace tool, called the Intercultural Development Inventory. We use this tool to help churches and Christian organizations have this kind of conversation, begin to do this probative work. It is a tool that helps to assess your degree of intercultural competence, right? It's a tool that helps to say, because, right, today at least, you'd be hard pressed to find a church that says, no, we don't want to welcome other people, you know, and we're not interested in hospitality here, right? Yeah. But again, we usually don't know how our cultural preferences and commitments communicate welcome or non-welcome to people who are different. And we usually also don't know, how do we actually have that conversation,
Mm.
How do we actually identify those things? And so we use this tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory to help with this assessment, and then have help churches and organizations have this conversation. Okay, well, who are we, and what does it mean that this is our degree of intercultural competence? We think we are much more competent than we actually are, and that's typically the case, right? I mean, it's like when I'm trying to eat right and I'm calorie counting. Like, I always undercount the calories in a particular right thing, right? Like, we do this with lots of things, right? Overestimate or underestimate depending on where we desire to be, right?
Yeah.
And so we utilize a tool like this, and help have these kinds of conversations, and then help churches kind of lay out a path forward, to doing the kinds of things that I talk about in the book, counting the cost. Because once you identify some things, you have to say, okay, what things here might we be willing to hold a little more loosely and be willing to change or modify for the sake of loving our neighbors who are different? What does it look like for us practically to have a heart shift that begins to center ourselves less, and strive to center love of our neighbors more? Meaning, how do they receive love? How is it best for us to communicate love? Right? Married couples know this, right? Like, I know that I have certain desires and preferences in terms of what it means to be loved, right? Mm. And if I just impose all those on my wife and say, well, these are the things I like, and these are the things that communicate love to me, and I do them, and she doesn't respond with gratitude and having received this immense amount of love, I would say, what's wrong with you? I've been loving you, right? Mm. But that's not how she receives love. It's not, right? And so so my intention, right, has had a very different impact than I was striving for. And the fact that I intended something different doesn't lessen the impact. Right? Yeah. It doesn't lessen how she feels, right? Whether she feels loved or not, right? And so it's a similar kind of concept. And we begin to say, okay, how do we work on beginning to center and love our neighbors well? What does that look like? Who are our neighbors? Again, I'm rambling, but these are kind of some of the things that we have to begin living into. And last thing I'll say on this question is, it's not, you can probably tell, this is not like just doing a sermon series on reconciliation and justice, or doing a small group Bible study and say we're now moving in this direction. This is about a long-term process. This is about a patient process. It's about striving to go on a particular trajectory for the long term, for the foreseeable future, right? So it's not, so I need to say at church, and we try to communicate to churches and ministries and organizations, don't look for a quick fix. There's no magic bullet here, right? This is labor before the Lord. It's laying your heart out before the Lord and pressing forward and trusting Him to do the work, right? But you not knowing how long it's going to take to change, and you not actually being in control of that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ince, you've been so good with your time here. I would just love to ask you one more question, and you kind of referenced it there. I would love to know. I mean, this is your work. This is what you do. You reference the Institute for Cross-Cultural Mission. You're a pastor. You're a church planter. You've given yourself to this. How have you not given up? How do you how do you stay? How do you just keep going and persevering in the work?
Man, so man, it's such a good and important question, because I I go through these periods of of disappointment and wondering, are we ever going to see this kind of growth in pursuing beautiful community on a larger scale? And so as much hopefulness there is, and I'm more hopeful than not, there are also seasons of great difficulty, right? And for me, it really is two things. One, a sense of calling to the work, that this is my heart passion, and I don't believe that I created the passion. I believe that it was given to me by the Lord, and that this is his calling. And his calling always involves complete dependence on him. Like, if I was called to this and I proved that I could do it in my own strength, it likely is not going to be his call, right? So a having to live into and remind myself of what the Lord said to Paul when he pleaded with the Lord in 2 Corinthians, that he would remove the thorn from his flesh, the thorn of flesh, right, that was given to him, right? To keep him from being conceited, he said, right? When the Lord says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, so that I will therefore all the more boast of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ would rest upon me, right? So the perseverance is in the embrace and recognition of my limitation and my weakness and my dependence on the Lord in this calling. And until he demonstrates to me implicitly and explicitly, internally and externally, that I need to be doing something else, this is what I'm going to be doing.
Yeah.
Right? And then, again, the second thing, and these are interchangeable, but this is where God is taking humanity. Right? It's his. It's not my plan. It's his plan, right? And so I can't turn my eyes away from that. As we talked about earlier in this conversation, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so if I go and I start to press and do something different, or press in a different direction toward a different end, what do I do with what I've seen? Right? So yeah.
Man, I love that. I love that. Dr. Ince, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Yeah, it's going really fast. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, anybody that's watching or listening, they want to follow you online, get in touch with you. What are some places that they can connect with you?
Sure. I mean, I have a Facebook page, an author's page. Reverend Irwyn L. Ince Jr. on Facebook. On Twitter, it's just at Irwyn, IRWY as in yellow, N. Right, Irwyn's not a name anybody's going to spell right, at least the way mine is spelled, right? I'm on Instagram as well at Pastor Irwyn. And then our Institute for Cross-Cultural Mission is the website URL is gracedc.institute. And they can find out much about ICCM and our work and get connected with us.
All right. All that'll be in the show notes.
Oh, last thing I say, I see I'm the poor self-promoter. I do
go
have
ahead.
a website, IrwynInce.com. I've got that too.
All right.
Yes. So there you go. That's all the things.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, we'll link to all that so everybody can just go to the show notes, find it, and connect with you. Hey, Dr. Irwyn Ince, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been great.
Yeah, Brother Mark, this has been outstanding. Thanks.